Twitch catch up with the world. I think Twitch should know that I'm streaming and not show me ads. And I'm still struggling through sinuses, so I will suppress coughs and sneezes and things for as long as I can. Okay, so we're going to continue on with refactoring the Mudz game that we're writing. I went ahead and, if you go to GitHub, made a repository and committed the code there, and to also do my best to keep the README pretty tidy. So our first milestone would be the factory pattern, which is the code kata we did all last week. And once we're done making all the things, or at least getting some good practice in with that factory pattern in the game, go ahead and link that commit here in the README, so that in the future, if I or anybody else wanted to come back through and see the game at those various lockstep stages, they'd be able to. Alright, so refactor. Next is a tip that Made of Candy last week gave us for the chaining of constructors. So instead of doing two constructors and repeating the code here, instead we can call this and pass in an empty string. It's actually a pretty good one. There is the argument that you can just use the defaults, or the default parameters here. But the difference between doing this and doing this, say this is now, ReSharper is telling us this is now redundant. So this gives you the same functional benefits of being able to call new player, or in our case, instantiate from the factory, and not have to pass in a name. However, this is going to require a recompilation of anything that uses our Mudz core DLL. So not a huge deal, but it is one of those probably great interview questions and things that comes up quite often. It's that if you're in an enterprise environment or any kind of continuous integration environment, and multiple things rely on core, and the core DLL just gets dropped into that build stream. So let's say that we finish our game, we've got a web app, we've got the actual game interface itself, we've got a server, and all three of those things require the core DLL. and we make a change to that DLL, and we say, okay, next time each one of these things builds, grab the latest core, package it all up, and ship it on down. With this, you would have to, this is again assuming that, for example, the game references core directly. This approach, you'd have to recompile each one of those applications. So you have to recompile the console, the actual game itself, the server, and also the web, which isn't something that's always available or preferred, especially from a testing perspective. If you're using Microsoft's new release management, you want those bits to stay the same. So when you publish to test, once it's been proofed out in test, those very same bits get moved over to, let's say, user integration testing, and then all the way to production. And if in each one of those steps you're swapping out DLLs as appropriate, that process breaks if you have to recompile your calling application every time. So for us, not a huge deal if we wanted to do it this way, but it is a point to note that if you've got that constraint, then the constructor chaining is going to be your better bet, which again is just this. Okay, so that was the point that Native Candy made. I made good on my end, did my homework, and learned something. And that kind of goes in the list of things that require recompilation. The other one would be read-only versus constant. Let's do that real quick. If I had this constant property and I said this will never ever change, it's the same thing as the default parameter, where if it does change in this core DLL, because I'm using constant, anything that references it also has to recompile, as opposed to read-only gives me a lot of the same benefits, but I don't have to recompile. All right, so, and the only other point to refactor here is we're calling public, which, again, has the same functional equivalent in this abstract class. I'm calling protected. ReSharper is complaining because it doesn't tell you this, which is why it's always good to question what ReSharper is doing or telling you, but it will make you a better programmer. It doesn't make any sense because there's no reason for play to be publicly available because you can instantiate a new abstract class. So while it's functionally the same as protected, it just doesn't make any sense. Which might seem, it's like, well, if I can do it, why shouldn't I do it? There's a lot of things that we get lazy about because we assume Visual Studio, I say we, I mean I, get lazy about because I assume Visual Studio, well, if it lets me do it, I must be right. And that's not always the case. As you get closer and closer to the metal, as it were, you'll see that the people who write, the C# language, the people that code Visual Studio, are fallible and they're human, and you might be coding against a loophole or a blind spot that gets patched later on, and you never knew, and it's a breaking change for you when all they've done is correct a problem. All right, so the two things we refactored inside of our player class was we said we're going to use this constructor chaining to reduce some duplication of code. We're also going to make these constructors protected. And the protected keyword just means that it can only be called from a derived class, which makes more sense against the abstract keyword. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to come into Trilio for our factory pattern, Kata. And I'm going to say, make a note, which it doesn't, okay. Make a comment. So okay. So hopefully when we come back through, if we're diligent enough to read our notes, we can start refining this kata, start working it in, and have something else that gets sharpened every time we run through it. Okay, let's come back over to base game object. Alright, not really going to change anything here so far. Really just looking to propagate the changes that we made here to anyplace else where it's applicable. Alright, so let's go into our NPC, which also implements our kata. And let's go ahead and let resharper, make that protected, save us some keystrokes. And then let's go ahead and implement the same constructor chaining here and pass in the string, clean that up. And we did our research, so we can remove that to do. Okay, did another to do here, which was to mark these abstract, because right now they're just public and void, and we definitely want them to be implemented by the calling with abstract void. Alright. Not the most glamorous coding, but it is rewarding to see things start to tighten up and to be readable and clear without having to put in a bunch of comments. String literals are an enemy of mine. Any red text, I definitely shake a finger at. And second to that is a lot of green text. Comments are great, especially XML comments that lend themselves to this concept of making an API explanatory just for developer comments beyond a certain point are definitely almost as bad as string literals for me. Alright. So last time Native Candy also made the note that we definitely make some default behavior for the NPCs. Makes a lot of sense. So just to recap a little bit, we've got NPCs and we've got players, and we've got two factories there, and they're the first two of our game objects. The other ones being monster, inventory item, and environment object. But they're going to vary greatly in their implementations. So while players probably wouldn't take damage all the same way, there's a good chance that quite a few NPCs are just going to take that damage straight on. They're going to process it the same way. There's no need to have to write that code over and over and over again for each implementation. We can just say, hey, let's just do it here. So hit points equal hit points minus damage. And I don't know if I made hit points a double. Yep. But I made it a private set. Let's get rid of that. Let's get rid of that. And heal is going to equal to hit points equals hit points plus health. Alright, so looking at the NPC class, we have our one constructor that is going to set all of our properties. Then a default constructor that utilizes constructor chaining. We've got the NPC type, which is where this guy starts to differentiate from a base game object and also conforms to the contract INPC, those properties and methods that all NPCs should have. Then I've got 3 methods that should be implemented by any NPC, because those will happen differently. Greeting will carry just a different basic string response with it. And then process command, depending on how we do things like quests and such, is also going to vary. Is going to vary greatly from, and then also response, obviously. So then we have take damage and heal damage being our 2 methods that every game object should have, but we're going to go ahead and override them inside of our abstract class so that all NPCs will have that default behavior until we decide to override it again in a concrete implementation of something like a deputy. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and, let's say, close all but this. All right, so a little more refactoring, just things as I remember them or as I see them. If I do my player factory, and I said Gary is going to be a politician. And so I type Gary dot, and IntelliSense tells me that Gary can attack, heal, move, negotiate, has a player type, and he can repair. What I don't see here is the game object type, which I should, because every player is derived from the game object, so I should be able to see everything that's inside of base game object. So let's go ahead and run back over to the player, which looks fine, the iPlayer anyway. And so what we notice is that while our player conforms to iPlayer, iPlayer doesn't have a contract with the iBase game object. So in our factory, we're returning a type of iPlayer. So we're telling the compiler, we're telling .NET that this result should only have what's available within this contract, and don't make reference to anything else. Just assume it's not there, which can be good if you want to hide things but still have them be part of the object. However, what we want to do is we want to make sure that iGameObject and iPlayer share these things. Oops. So what we're going to say is that the iPlayer contract inherits from the iGameObject. So this is really the only place right now in our game where we're different from the Kata, is we're kind of deep diving into a lot of object-oriented code and best practices and inheritance. So what we said here is we want whatever eventually implements iPlayer to also implement iGameObject properties and methods. But we're going to differentiate from or extend the properties of iGameObject here with player type, repair, attack, heal, negotiate, and move. So I don't know if I explained it well, but essentially anything that implements iPlayer will have to have these properties and methods in addition to everything inside of iGameObject. So then we go into player, we get the GameObject methods and properties simply by inheriting from the base GameObject abstract class. And we're going to go ahead and implement all of the iPlayer properties and methods here in line. So now when I save all this, I come back over to program, and I hit dot again. Well, now I do have not only the game object type, but I've got dexterity, I've got hit points, I can tell whether Gary's destructible, probably true. And so yeah, I have access to everything that I would if he was just a game object, in addition to all the things because he's a player. Alright, so players are feeling pretty good. Something else that I would like players to have is a int for experience. That's going to be pretty standard. Alright, let's keep poking around and see if we see anything that is weird, strange, needless. In the interest of not pre-optimizing, because we have some base functionality for these two, let's go ahead and pull them out where we see them, because we don't want any code that we don't know if we need yet. So we'll wait until we know we want to extend. We'll override that functionality before we include it. Oh, I'm sorry. No, we can't, because we made the choice that we knew we wanted to always do it. And so we didn't add that base functionality to player, just to NPC. Alright, that looks good. Arguing with ourselves, so that's a good sign. What did past me decide with the architecture? And are they smarter than current me or future me? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Alright, so why don't we also just to see how this might work, let's go ahead and say that all NPCs will also have a base hit points of 100. So in terms of our world and our modeling, we're saying that hit points for NPCs have a base of 100. Sorry about the coughing. Might be more, might be less. But let's start it all there. Coming into our program, and we've got the townsperson Morgan. Let's go and say console.writeLine. We'll use our parameters here. Morgan is a something. He has hit points. So we're going to say townsperson dot. Oops. Let's come back over in the NPC factory. Let's go into the same thing here, where all NPCs, same thing to the player, to get access to things like name. Let's go ahead and say that, hey, all NPCs are going to have the same properties as any other game object. So that it'll have access to that here. Alright, so we're just going to do a quick little test of our modeling so far. I'm going to say that blank is a blank, and he has, or she, has a certain number of hit points. Thank you, Masturbator is correct. We've got hit points and a bunch of things, but no levels. I don't know if I want to model levels yet, because I'm not actually quite sure how it's going to work. But no, yeah, but I guess if we're going to do one and not the other, it's weird. So let's go back into here, and we'll say add that to iPlayer. Okay, so experience level, and really, yeah, as we think of them, as they come up, let's go and just throw them in there. All the fun stuff that players should have. It's really kind of, I don't even know what, but to see these things in something you're writing, it's just neat. Okay, so will this build? Nope. Because inside of our townsperson, we did not implement our new abstract methods. We're going to let Resharper do the heavy lifting here, because we're lazy. Sheriff as well. Let's go and clear up some errors. Shopkeeper. So it's probably not the best practice, but it is very efficient to make an architectural change, build it to see where it breaks, and let that be your, you're ready to go back in. It can get messy sometimes if you're really relying on just this to show you where you need to implement your architectural changes. And I haven't used something like .cover, but I definitely want to incorporate that into my personal software process, which is good to have. And if people aren't familiar with that buzzword, personal software process, just saying what tools and methods do I use, regardless of what team I'm on, what styling guides might be available in my organization or amongst my friends. What do I do to ensure my code quality is as high as it can be? And that should be a kind of a living document or a living idea, and you're constantly improving. So when people ask you something like, well, how do you ensure good code coverage? Saying, well, I'm a good developer is a pretty weak answer. You definitely want to be able to point to some pretty well vetted steps you take. Okay. So let's go ahead and close out. Get rid of program. Go ahead and close all but this. Let's go ahead and build again. And so another little point about C#, or just Visual Studio, I guess, is, and ReSharper is good about this as well. I'm going to seek sponsorship from JetBrains, the maker of ReSharper, because I'm going to be saying that name over and over and over again. So they're giving me a hint here by making it gray. Not only is it not used, but because it's not used, the compiler, when it's in debug mode, is going to ignore it. And to be honest, I'm not even sure that it would ever make it into the DLL or the CLR if it wasn't in debug mode. But it's important to note here, because if it's not being used and I debug, I will never hit this breakpoint. But because townsperson is used, it will hit this one. It's a spooky behavior that the first time you see it, you're going to scratch your head and you're going to say, I'm going crazy. But if you know that anything that isn't being used is going to be skipped over, but ReSharper lets you put the breakpoint there. and that'll throw you off. So let's go ahead and make sure CLI is my starting project, which you can tell by it being, white versus, I don't even know what that is, but it's highlighted. There's a glow. All right, so Morgan is a townsperson. He has 100 hit points. That worked out. So what happens when we say, let's go ahead and change townsperson and do a refactor and a rename to we know it's Morgan. Done. All right. What happens when Morgan takes damage as an NPC? Well, we have hit points, but we definitely have access to the things we want. Let's go back. All right. So this is where we want to remove these things, because town person is an NPC. We want townsperson to use the default. Let's go ahead and refactor these guys out. Oh, already gone. All right. NPC does all these things. You have take damage. So that is very strange. Let's do some sanity checks. Right, it's not a part of this, but it is part of iGameObject, so we'd expect to see it. Oh, there we go. So iGameObject does not have those methods, but base GameObject does. So let's go ahead and pull these guys out, not out, but let's go ahead and copy them. Come back into iGameObject, and then in an interface, we don't have any kind of access or constraints we can place on. So let's get rid of those. All right. So now we've said any game object must have take damage and heal. All right, and it's going to take a double. Alright, so then let's go ahead and take this same line and do this. We'll say console.writeLine, just to make things kind of game feely. And there's a method of this madness I'll talk about in a second. Let's say double DMG is equal to 13. Take damage, DMG. Alright, not going to convert that to a constant. I'm going to ignore resharper for right now. So, we really only know how to use the factory pattern right now. And while that's going to give us a lot of functionality in terms of making objects and even if we fall back on some good OOP practices, and some good inheritance knowledge, we can start to make some pretty robust game objects. Really, if you only knew this, you walked into like a game jam or something, or you wanted to be a part of a development team, and you said, "Hey, I wanna help out," and somebody said, "Well, what can you do?" You can say, "Well, I can get started with all of your factory stuff, all your game objects. I can start modeling that out and get that done for you." It's going to be a good exercise for you if you don't know anything, and the people in the game jam are going to love you because it can be tedious, and if you've got, a game with 36 objects, or three different types of game like 36 types of game objects, and you have to factory pattern all these out, you're probably going to stay pretty busy. But that's your ticket to ride right there. If you only know this, you could broker your way onto a team. Ah, yes, Zeus, I am standing up. I am working out the kinks in my standing desk, which right now is a table on top of a table, and my keyboard is sitting on top of a Xbox One cardboard box. And so if you see me duck to the side real fast or look down, it's because I'm looking at the chat to see if anybody has any questions or comments. All right, so super simple here. We've said, blank is a blank, and he or she has blank hit points. To satisfy those parameters, we're going to say Morgan's name, type, and hit points. Now we're going to do damage, and we're going to have Morgan take damage. We're going to console out that Morgan has taken that damage, and then we're going to see what his or her hit points are at the end. Okay. So I did not pass in Morgan as a name. Shame on me. So I threw an exception. All right, so Morgan's a townsperson, has 100 hit points. Morgan takes 13 damage, and now is still a townsperson, hasn't changed and probably won't. Now has 87 hit points. So, just this feels pretty good as far as all we've done is implement the factory pattern and some basic OOP, and you could write a game. You could write a very, very simple console, menu-driven, basic AI, let me fight. So you could do some display menus, some read keys, and then have kind of a tit-for-tat battle with a monster where one round consists of you swinging, doing damage to the monster, and then it swinging and doing damage to you, and the first person to 0 hit points, dies. So you could do all that very, very procedurally and make it work. What we're hoping to do is employ design patterns, not just in the creation of objects and the behavior of players, but also do design patterns that are going to make this area much nicer to work with, so that we can, instead of writing out things explicitly, we can call it game engine. We can call that API, and we can request things from the game engine. So instead of us saying Morgan take damage, we can do something, and this is going to be, weeks from now as we get through all of our design patterns. But just to get a glimpse at the end, what we want to be able to do is to take in user input and simply say game engine dot process user dot command. And that's all we want to do. And if the result of that command is that Morgan has 13 less health, so be it. But we won't be in charge of tracking that or distributing that information to the rest of the game, which is super important, because if we want to have a multi-user dungeon, then the fact that Morgan takes 13 points of damage might be something that various other players and things in the game need to know. And we don't want to sit here and write a bunch of checks and a bunch of declarations and explicit calls to try to keep track of everybody that needs to know that after every call. We want to create a game engine that does that. And this game as an example is a great one because it's sufficiently complex, meaning that we can write this game and we can touch on all the creational design patterns, all the structural design patterns, all the behavioral design patterns. We can branch out from the basic group of design patterns and look into things like design patterns for distributed networks, design patterns for social networks, design patterns for command query, responsibility separation, event sourcing, auditing. There's just a lot here that we can dig into. At the same time, milestoning our progress and seeing what's possible at every milestone. Like right now, we can do things against our game. We can take damage, we can heal, we could speak, we could build all this stuff in. There's also things that we can't do without introducing a lot of complexity, and we want to flatten that complexity with design patterns. Right, sure. Alright, so, oops, mic is. So yeah, Zeus, we will be, and I'm a big fan of command query responsibility separation and also event sourcing. So, and just like the factory pattern, it's something that you should be able to write tailored towards the game or the application or whatever have you. No, you're not being rude at all. It's a perfectly valid question, and it's actually a very exciting one too. So I've got a project called Sharpbox that implements those design patterns for an event system, and I use it for intranet applications, so line of business stuff in the enterprise, and it works out really well. And kind of give a peek at the future. This is in my GitHub. If you want to grab it, you're welcome to. So, and if you're a beginner out there, or feel free to kind of tune out for a second. Don't take anything that you see here too seriously, because we'll get to it in time. All right. So if you go to the console project, it demonstrates talking to this API, right? And so as an example, I do dispatch, process, a type, a command, a message, parameters, and so I'm able to, and then this dispatcher will then call the appropriate command. It'll then broadcast the result of that method to any listeners. So it's also a pub sub. It'll then audit, or an audit record, so that you can see in order the events as they come in. And this is going to be really critical in the game. For example, when you go to debug, when you've got all of these race conditions, they're going to come in from different users, and when you're debugging that everything happened in the right order, things like this are going to be absolutely critical. All right. So to answer your question in the most long-winded way possible, yes, the event sourcing, command patterns, all that good stuff, command query responsibility separation, we're going to cover all those things in the making of the game. We're just going to try to build up to them with the basic patterns first. Zeus, like my biggest fan right now. Yeah. So once I'm done with this stream, um, um, I'm harvesting the files from Twitch because it's a pretty poor platform for that, and I'll be uploading them to the YouTube channel. And I'm kind of learning as I go with all of this, but I think it'd be great to structure this game creation in this way where you could come to GitHub, you could, learn the factory pattern, watch the video, and I do check-ins at every point in the kata, so you'd be able to check out just that point in the kata and see the code before you move on, and you can code along with the video, and then so extending that over to the idea of the game, I'd love to be able to say, okay, I've gone through a factory pattern kata, I understand it. Let me now download the commit where the game was nothing but the factory pattern. Then you go through the strategy pattern, come back into the game, and you can see, along with watching the video, why we refactored things, why we changed things, and have the code when it was in that state. Either that, you're a fan. Why the tears? Why the tears? Not your fan. So yeah, so I agree. I think it'd be super helpful, and I think that if it's done this way, it'll allow people to run through at their own pace, rerun through, use the katas, and you'll see down here, after decorator, I've got that command clear responsibility separation. I've got that event sourcing, and by the time we get through these four, this one should seem less daunting. Right now, if you look at the code, you're like, man, there's a lot going on here. But it really just is a lot of these principles being reused. Okay. Allergies. So, that's what we have. All right, so let's go ahead and fake some stuff real fast, right? Now, none of this is really in there right now, but I think it'd be cool just to kind of play around with, to kind of test out our game mechanics, what we have in mind. Let's say Beth is a medic. Morgan took 13 damage. And we're almost just writing fan fiction at this point, honestly. So we'll say another double heal, 13. But I think doing this way is gonna help us to start kind of brainstorming and seeing where we've got some places where we can really tidy things up. So, what I'll probably be doing is I'll be writing out, maybe not on camera, but I want to show you guys what I'm kind of be doing off camera, is writing out how I want the interactions to work, and then thinking about what kind of implementation it's going to take to bring that to life. So I think this is where the game stuff gets really fun, and because none of this has been written yet, really, if anybody wants to contribute ideas, yeah, I'm open to it. All right. So when we start talking about that game engine, um, when we do a command or something, an event happens, like Morgan takes damage. Right now, and the game engine shouldn't care, it should be agnostic. It shouldn't care where Morgan takes damage from, but if anyone's in the same room as Morgan, or if anything else relies on knowing that information, it should get that update. So, um, so every player, in terms of the pub sub pattern, is going to be listening on this kind of global channel, right? As well as on this room channel. And so anything that's broadcast to the room, they're going to see. So this would be an example of a message that everybody in the room should see. As conversely, maybe this is broadcast to the room channel, but hidden from Morgan. And Morgan sees, instead of saying Morgan takes blank damage, Morgan sees you take blank damage. Oh, my goodness. If that your fan is my biggest fan, then I apologize. But I gotta see it. Can't just take it on faith. All right. So let's go ahead and do. Let's go ahead and see how many hit points Morgan has now. And just so we can kind of see a flow, let's go ahead and throw in some read keys. Let's go ahead and start it. All right, so for whatever reason, Morgan takes 13 damage and has 87. Beth moves to heal Morgan. Beth heals Morgan for 20 hit points. Whoa. Morgan now has 107 hit points. So this enters into the question of what kind of checks do you do to ensure that the person's stats never go above their max, right? And this is a great segue into what we'll be doing with the strategy pattern next week. So we're going to say, well, we want a strategy for every, base strategy, as well as maybe a strategy for every player that's going to allow their player type, whether a medic, an army veteran, whatever have you, to process these things differently. And we probably also want some default behavior built in that says, hey, whatever your base hit points are, whatever your max hit points are, you can't go above them. So these are things that we want to see what design pattern is best to tackle which with. We'll also have, after next week during the strategy pattern, we've got the state pattern being where we want to maintain the state of a character over time. So it's kind of a lot at you, but we're starting to see how these things could happen. We don't really have a game engine yet to string them all together, but we don't want one. What we want right now is being able to go through, create these kind of fictional scenarios, see what features are missing, see what properties are missing, see what interaction we want, and play around and see how that actually comes together. And then we can say, man, okay, this battle plays really well, and this is the way that we want to see it every time. Then we can take that prototype and start to code it into our game engine. And when we get to our game engine, we're going to talk about coding up that event sourcing system tailored to these kind of battle scenes and mechanics. But again, so as you can see, we could do some stuff here. We could say, hey, read key, whatever have you. But it'll get really messy really fast. And making changes to this kind of programming is going to be really, really painful. So we're going to want to find a way to make this better in a few weeks. one of the things we will do, just for giggles, let's go ahead and set some, wait, what was Morgan? Morgan was a townsperson. And in our NPC factory, okay, looks good. In the last 3 or 4 minutes, just trying to see if there's anything I might want to add. Ah, Angry Masturbator. That actually feels pretty good. I like that. Experience gives levels, levels give stats, etc., etc. It feels pretty good. I'm going to take that note, and I mean, we don't have a better idea right now, right? So, and that one feels pretty good. So we'll start incorporating it. And we're going to do that with strategy patterns. So I don't want to jump the gun quite yet, because we could really spend, and we will next week, spend a lot of time looking at the power of the strategy pattern and how to implement stats and how to implement statuses. So if your player is drunk, if they've been buffed, if they are nervous or excited, and then what effect that has on your stats. So if you're nervous, does your attack strength go down by 2 points? You know, maybe. And those are going to be strategies that we can apply to our characters when those states occur, and then remove those states when something else happens, right? All right, so we have default hit points, which is fine. Just for townsperson, let's go ahead and say for greet, let's go ahead and change this. One last refactor with the 2 minutes we have left. And let's make greet and respond. Let's go back to our NPC. Well, close that. Close that. Let's go ahead and refactor this. Okay. Well, I thought I would have access to a change definition. I thought Resharp gave me access to that, but I could be wrong. It's not letting me do the things that I want. Alright, so we'll just do it the hard way. We'll make those 2 things strings. So we're expecting a string response. And let's do the build to find our problems, like bad developers. And for my homework, I'm going to look into why Resharper didn't let me refactor those things. Maybe I'm making up that ability. It does know. I feel like there must be a way to get Resharper to be smarter about that change. I could do a global find and replace for anything where void greet is found, replace it with string greet, and the same thing for respond. I'll tell you why I don't do that all the time. I just get into bigger projects, and you'd be surprised how often naming conventions get reused and you change things you don't want to. And going through that cognitive process of evaluating all the finds, maybe not even as effective as just finding out where it breaks. So I'll try to outgrow that bad behavior, but I'll look for a better way to do it, I'll say. Okay, let's go into townsperson. And when they greet, I want it to return hello. I would say that, right? That's all I wanted to do. And we'll be this last thing we do before we wrap it up. I think it's fun to see kind of what we have already, how it kind of comes to the screen. Oh, which brings up a great thing we'd probably want all things to do. Hold on, I'll do this first. All right, so, and then we do a console.read keyed here. And we'll just see what happens. All right, so if I call greet, it's like, hello, what brings you to this place? And maybe I want to say, let's go ahead and pretty this up a bit. All right. So what we've done the same kind of string format where we say blank says blank. We've escaped the quotes, so we can put his greeting in quotes or her greeting. We don't know. We don't know the gender of Morgan. Morgan's an enigma. So we say Morgan says hello. What brings you to this place? Super simple. The other good takeaway from these formatted strings is, if you look at the Sharpbox application in GitHub, you'll see that there's this concept of text resources. So, like I said before, red text is the enemy. We should have default strings set up and placed aside for things like dialogue, conversation, taking hits, being buffed. Until we get into our event sourcing, that pairing is going to be user submits a command. Command gets processed, and then the responses are paired up with the text resources for that response. And the parameters are passed in, and then we'll get a very nice output. So whenever somebody puts in a command for attack, it's going to run into the game engine. It's going to churn up all these responses, execute the action, notify whoever it needs to, and then output the neatly formatted string. So it's actually really exciting, and I think it's going to come together really well. All right. 5 minutes over. We're in bonus time now. One last thing. As a player, I would love to have the ability to void inspect. That's it. That's all I want. And for this one, I do want. I'm gonna throw in a not yet implemented because we haven't done it yet. Seems like a pretty basic game mechanic there that players should be able to inspect items, be able to inspect game objects. And this also lends itself back to the idea of having this base game object be the thing that every object in the game derives from, so that for basic things like inspect, they can all be processed the same way, and that code reuse really becomes a strong part of our architecture. And we're doing the not implemented exception here, and you can see that practice kind of bearing fruit where townsperson has defined greet, but nothing else, and nobody else does either. So if we called, if we asked the deputy to greet, it would throw an exception of not yet implemented, and that's the behavior we want right now. All right, so that's it. I'm going to go ahead and check this in. In our case, commit it. And I'll sync it. All right, so if you came to GitHub and you clone this, you'll see that it went up to 3 commits. All the code we just wrote is going to be available there if you want to go and look at it. As always, the factory pattern kata has our kata for looking at that factory pattern. And I probably will, behind the scenes, just do some of the mundane coding of creating objects and following this pattern. But I'll stop, and I won't do anything that's going to implement the strategy pattern, because that's what we want to look at next week, and I think it's going to be really fun. All right, thank you for tuning in.
Rated E10 for ages 10 and up.
My name's Dennis McCarthy, and I've been the picture car coordinator for the Fast and Furious franchise now for over 10 years. The beauty of the Forza